We're listening to Newshour. The row about the manipulation of a key London interest rate, Libor, rumbles on with the appearance today at a parliamentary committee of Paul Tucker, the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England. There have been suggestions that he was in some way complicit with the manipulation of the rate. Those claims centre on a phone call between Mr Tucker and the then Chief Executive of Barclays, Bob Diamond. And Mr Tucker told MPs today that it would have been unreasonable for Mr Diamond to interpret that telephone call as any sort of instruction to lower the bank's Libor rate.
I wanted him to be sure that the senior management of Barclays was overseeing the day-to-day money market operations and treasury operations and funding operations of Barclays, so that Barclays' money desk did not inadvertently send distress signals.
Alan Riley is a professor at the City Law School at the City University London, and Dan Conahan is the author of The Bank, Inside the Bank of England, published just a few months ago, and he spent 12 years working in the city. And he was watching this afternoon's parliamentary hearing.
Paul Tucker, who is, as you say, Deputy Governor, but has actually been at the bank for 30 years, in fact, a little over 30 years, and so is one of the longest-serving officials of the bank, was in front of the Treasury Select Committee for about 2 3/4 hours, really at his own request, in that after Bob Diamond's evidence last week, which essentially cited Paul Tucker as his interlocutor on that now notorious phone call, Paul Tucker requested essentially an audience with the Treasury Select Committee. So today, I think, was notable on many fronts, but not least for the fact that Paul Tucker was on his own. We've seen Paul Tucker in front of this committee many, many times over his career, but always at the elbow of, latterly, Sir Mervyn King, the Governor of the Bank of England. This was the first time that we saw the Deputy Governor essentially looking back at the time when he was in charge of this beating heart of the Bank of England, which was the Markets Division, and the period from 2002 to 2009, when Paul Tucker was Executive Director of Markets. And what does that really mean? Well, the Markets Division is somewhere between God and Mammon. It sees everything. It is the dealing room of the Bank of England.
Right. So he was in a really good position to know what was going on. But it's not just a question of his knowledge, is it? Did he try to manipulate this key interest rate? Isn't that the key question?
I think the question was whether he tried to exert some influence on Bob Diamond, or indeed was relaying influence which might be exerted by ministers, unnamed, or senior civil servants. Jeremy Haywood's name has been cited, to essentially get Barclays to lower its Libor fixes, because high Libor fixes rather implied that Barclays was in trouble and that might need some sort of government bailout.
And did he give a convincing account that there's no foul play, let's put it like that, there was no inappropriate advice or conduct?
He gave a very robust defence of those conversation and so on. However, I think that what he tried to do today was to give a narrow account of the Libor debacle. And I think that history may yet relate that what we really need to do is look at a much broader view of Libor. And I think that Paul Tucker chose his words very carefully. He's been at the bank for 30 years, so he knows how to do that. And there was also a lot of nuance around what he was saying. But I think what he was trying to do was to keep the debate within the confines of the Bob Diamond conversation and a particular set of unusual circumstances around October 2008. I think that was slightly disingenuous of him.
Right, not to discuss the big issues, and this brings in Professor Alan Riley very well, because you think there are very big issues flowing from this.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about this is to try and get a sense of the scale. Libor is, if you like, the central rate for interest rates. It is basically used for about $350 to $400 trillion worth of financial products worldwide. And that's, to give you, I mean, this is to give you some idea, the total size of the British economy is just over $2 trillion. So this is enormous.
And is it true that people will have lost money as a result of the rate being manipulated, in which case they could sue for damages?
Well, there's already a case that's brought by the City of Baltimore. And, of course, they're claiming that at various points the Libor rate was put up further than it should have been, so they lost out. They had to pay more in interest than they should have done. And there's some assessment of, just in terms of the US municipal funds, that's funding for bridges, motorways, whatever, in the United States by towns and cities and states. The number there is potentially $40 billion claim.
I mean, these are huge sums and disastrous for the City of London. Who would pay that money?
Well, one of the issues about this is not just a London issue. I mean, we've got Barclays involved in this, but the majority of banks aren't British.
Uh-huh.
You know, you've got German banks, you've got American banks, you've got Japanese banks.
All involved in the Libor rate.
Yeah, fixing the 16 participating banks. So whether all of them were fixing it or whatever, that's got to be found out. And one of the issues about this also is that the great investigative power here is not in Britain but in the United States, with the US Department of Justice, particularly in relation to competition law and price fixing, where they have incredibly powerful investigative powers.
So let me ask you both, and start with you, Dan. Do you think this really could lead to a very big problem in London and big change in London?
I think the biggest change is probably imminent is that the hitherto unregulated market of Libor, overseen by a rather sort of disparate organisation in the British Bankers Association, will just end very soon. And it will move probably under the aegis of a proper authority like the Prudential Regulatory Authority, which starts next year, ironically enough, as a subsidiary of the Bank of England. I think that would be the first obvious change.
That's quite a technical thing. But then, Professor, do you think, looking further ahead, that this will lead to more change in the city than that?
I think so. And the point about this is that if you've got a situation where the US is prosecuting and jailing large numbers of bankers,
that could happen?
I think so, because the point about price fixing is a criminal offence in the United States. They have jurisdiction and the ability to extradite people to the United States.